She thought she had inherited a mansion, but what awaited her beneath the earth was something much older than any inheritance. Hello, my friends. Before we dive into the madness and daydreams, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. The mist had descended like a spectral veil over Ashford Hollow on that chilly October morning in 1952, when the body of Lord William Arkham was found in the mansion's library. The room, sealed for decades, had been opened only because the servants had heard a sharp sound in the early morning, something between a muffled scream and the creak of wood under pressure, when the butler, a pale, stooped man named Mr. Hargrove, reluctantly pushed open the door. He found the aristocrat slumped over his desk, his chest ripped open at an impossible angle, his eyes rolled back, fixed on the Gothic stained glass ceiling, as if contemplating something no man should see. The scene was silent, but the air seemed to vibrate with invisible echoes. The official version, suicide, but the whispers among the servants said otherwise. He heard again, the whispers in the walls. Annabel Arkham received the telegram while sipping coffee in her small apartment in Boston. The name of the property, Arkham House, made her shiver. She had left England at 15, taken there by an aunt who claimed the place was cursed. Now, with the death of her estranged uncle, the last heir to the Arkham line, she was the only one left of the old blood. When she arrived in the village, she was greeted by a mixture of curious and fearful looks. "You shouldn't have come back," an old woman at the station had said, before disappearing into the fog. The carriage dropped her off in front of the mansion, and as she climbed the cracked steps to the porch, she felt something, as if the bricks were breathing. "My God, is this real?" she murmured, staring at the dark windows like glass eyes. The first night in the mansion was too quiet. Annabel walked through the hallways with a candle in her hands, observing the portraits of ancestors with painted eyes that seemed to follow her. The walls creaked as if they were adjusting to her presence. The room where she was accommodated still held the smell of old wood and burning incense. Before going to sleep, she found a note left on the nightstand. The shaky handwriting read, "If you hear a knock 3 times, do not answer." Frightened, she put the paper in her suitcase and decided the next day to hire someone who could investigate her uncle's strange death. It was then that she remembered an article she had read months before about a London journalist who unmasked false cults and fraudulent mediums. His name was Jonathan Hale. Jonathan was not the kind of man who was easily impressed. Tall, sharp-eyed and cynical by nature, he had confronted fraudsters who claimed to speak to the dead and exposed churches that promised exorcisms in exchange for donations. When he was asked to investigate a suspicious death in an old remote mansion, his instinct was to decline. But something in Annabel's voice on the phone, a hesitation laced with fear and fascination, piqued his curiosity. "I don't believe in ghosts, Miss Arkham, but I do believe in madness, and it tends to run in families," she said. Nevertheless, he boarded the train the next morning, carrying only his tape recorder, a notebook, and the desire to prove once again that the supernatural is just the name given to human ignorance. As the train crossed the misty fields and reached the small station in Ashford Hollow, Jonathan stepped off with a firm but hesitant step. The fog seemed thicker here, as if the world around the estate refused to be seen. Annabel was waiting for him with a black umbrella and a weary look in her eyes. As they shook hands, he realized that her fingers were as cold as marble. "It's not just a house," "It's like being inside a throat that's about to swallow you," she said, almost in a whisper. He smiled sideways, trying to remain skeptical, but when he saw the mansion silhouetted against the trees, with its broken gargoyles and soot-covered stained glass windows, something inside him, an ancient, primitive part, wanted to recoil. "Let's uncover this theatre of horrors," he declared, but the mist seemed to mock the words. Jonathan walked through the iron gates of Arkham House with measured steps, listening to the creaking of the hinges that seemed to complain of his presence. The stone path was covered in dark moss, and the sound of his shoes echoed in an unnatural silence. As he entered the mansion, he felt a sudden heaviness in his chest, as if the air were too dense, heavy with dust, memories, and something undefined. The main hall looked like a forgotten reliquary. Decaying tapestries, cracked mirrors, clocks that had stopped for decades. "This looks more like a mausoleum than a home," he murmured, noting the gargoyles carved into the banister of the staircase. Mr. Hargrove appeared like a shadow, guiding him to the guest room, where the cold seemed to emanate from the floor itself. "The house, it doesn't like change," the butler said, before disappearing back into the hallways. The next morning, Jonathan decided to explore the ground floor. He walked through vast halls with unlit fireplaces, corridors that seemed to stretch with the dim light of candles, and doors that creaked as if they were crying. The atmosphere made him feel watched. As he approached a wing on the east side, he noticed a door locked with 3 different locks. Above it, carved in blackened stone, was the Latin inscription, "Libera me ex abyssum." Annabel appeared behind him, pale. "This is the library. Since his death, no one has dared to enter," she said, avoiding the journalist's gaze. Jonathan wrote down the inscription and was silent for a moment. A soft whisper ran down the corridor, as low as a breath, and he turned sharply, but there was no one there. Determined to begin their investigation with the resources they had, Annabel led Jonathan to Lord William's old study, where some of his most recent journals were kept in a desk with carved oak coats of arms. He wrote obsessively, even in the wee hours of the morning. "I remember the sounds of his pen scratching against the paper, even when the whole house was asleep," she said, handing him the first notebook. Jonathan leafed through it, reading passages that spoke of the voice beneath the boards, the mirror without reflection, and some ancient mark that throbs beneath the foundations. The writing became increasingly frantic towards the final pages, with drawings of strange symbols, overlapping eyes, and endless spirals. He was losing his sanity, or writing to keep from being devoured by it, Jonathan mused. That night, as Jonathan was reviewing his writing, he heard footsteps in the hallway, light, rhythmic. When he opened the door, he found Annabel walking toward the west wing, her eyes completely closed. "Annabel!" he called, but she didn't answer. He followed her to a wall covered in tapestries, where she stopped, reached out and murmured something in a language he didn't recognize. When she woke, she was confused, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's always the same. I'm standing in front of a door that beats like a heart, and I know she's alive," she whispered. Jonathan, touched by the despair in her voice, decided he wouldn't dismiss it as hysteria. Not anymore. Something in the house was working on her, and if it was a mass delusion, then it was the most realistic thing he had ever seen. Over the next few days, Jonathan noticed a subtle but unsettling change in the mansion. Furniture seemed to shift slightly from one night to the next. Mirrors, even those covered with cloth, would briefly reflect the silhouette of someone who was not in the room. The servants were silent, their gazes constantly cast to the floor. When questioned, the gardener whispered, "The blood has returned to the house. What was sealed now listens." Jonathan, increasingly skeptical of his own mental security, began to write down not only the facts but also his feelings. "The house breathes, and it does not like me being here. But there is something even older, something that whispers through Annabel." One afternoon, while poring over a second of Lord William's diaries, Jonathan and Annabel came across a page that had been torn out, leaving only fingernail marks on the paper, as if someone, in a moment of desperation, had tried to forcibly erase it. There were fragments that mentioned the return of the hidden blood and a startling passage. "She has been listening ever since she was a child. I failed to keep her away." Jonathan closed the notebook slowly, glancing at Annabel, who stood silently, her eyes fixed on the stained glass window above the fireplace. "Do you remember anything strange from your childhood? Any episodes, dreams, anything?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, then murmured, "I remember doors. Always doors. They breathed." The silence that followed between them was not just awkward, it was reverent, as if something beyond them was listening too. That night, during a violent storm that seemed to come from underground, Jonathan heard footsteps in the hallway again, but this time he followed them more closely. He found Annabel standing in front of the mirror in the main hall, completely still. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not hers. It was a guttural language with broken, inhuman syllables. "Annabel!" he shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. She blinked, her eyes glazed over. "I was on the other side, but I was also this side," she said, before fainting in his arms. Jonathan took her back to her room, but remained by her side the entire night, sitting vigil. At dawn, she woke and held his hand tightly. "There is something inside me, Jonathan. Something that does not belong to me. Or perhaps it belongs to me more than anything," she confessed, her eyes full of terror. Their relationship, initially professional, began to change. The complicity and silence, the glances exchanged between the creaking of the boards and the moving shadows, created a strange intimacy. Forged by fear and curiosity, Jonathan found himself thinking about her even outside of the investigations, and she seemed to meet his gaze whenever he thought about leaving the house. One grey afternoon, he found her compulsively painting in one of the abandoned rooms. The walls were covered in spirals and eye-shaped symbols, concentric circles and indecipherable runes. "I don't know why I do this. My hands move on their own. I just need to free them," she said with a dazed expression. Jonathan tried to interrupt her, but when he touched her paint-stained fingers, he felt an electric shock that ran through his body, as if he were touching something beyond her. After that, they began sleeping in the same room, more for mutual security than desire. But on the nights when they allowed themselves some affection, the dreams came stronger, and they were shared. They both dreamed of endless hallways, doors that opened onto emptiness, voices that sang in unison, words that existed in no language. One such night, Jonathan woke to Annabel, whispering in the dark, "He wants to come. He calls me the key." He held her face firmly. "You are you, and we're going to find out what the hell is going on before it consumes you." She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on something he couldn't see, something that, he sensed, was very close. The tension grew with each passing day. Jonathan began to notice that the portraits of the Arkham family were changing their expressions. An ancestor who had been depicted with a serene expression now seemed to smile faintly, as if approving of the events. The old grandfather clock, which had stopped for years, began to chime midnight again, and more than once, as he walked alone through the halls, Jonathan heard the sound of breathing coming from within the walls. Not wind, not plumbing. Breathing, slow, rhythmic, like someone sleeping behind the boards. If we are dealing with something real, something that defies our understanding, I must see it through, he wrote in his notebook. But what if it's not just about her? What if all of this is about me too? Jonathan could no longer bear the feeling that the library was calling to him. Every time he passed through the east corridor, his eyes were drawn to the dark wooden door, and the inscriptions carved above it seemed to glow faintly, even in the dim candlelight. Libera me ex abyssum. Free me from the abyss. The phrase haunted him even in his dreams. One night, driven by restlessness and aided by Mr. Hargrove, who appeared like a spectre in the darkness of the corridor with a set of ancient keys, Jonathan decided to break the interdict. Your uncle made me promise never to open this again, but he also said, if I die, evil has won, so burn it all, the butler murmured, handing him the keys. The locks opened one by one with dry snaps, like vertebrae breaking. As Jonathan turned the handle, the air felt cold as the breath of a tomb. The library was a cathedral of decay. The walls were lined with bookshelves to the ceiling, filled with ancient books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in centuries. In the center, on a stone pedestal, sat a thick volume, bound in dark leather and secured with a metal latch. Jonathan approached with measured steps, feeling the temperature drop with every step. When he touched the grimoire, he heard a subtle sound, like the fluttering of an insect's wings inside his head. Nephron car et spiritibus, the spine read. Opening it, he felt as if he were violating an ancient tomb. The pages contained unfamiliar symbols, accounts of forgotten rituals, and mentions of an entity called Niog-Sehra, the Whisperer, described as a consciousness dormant in the depths of the world, feeding on the blood of those who acknowledge it. Each new page plunged Jonathan into a spiral of metaphysical horror. There were records of ancient rituals practiced by peoples who predated the formation of England itself, bloodlines devoted to the voice of the world's bowels, and maps of the underground passages hidden beneath Arkham House. The grimoire revealed that the Arkham family had been chosen to guard the seals that kept Niog-Sehra asleep. William, it seemed, had spent his final years trying to reinforce these seals, but the notes showed signs of growing desperation. The walls whisper again. The blood is near. The door throbs. Jonathan closed the book with a thud and stared up at the stained glass window above him, where a giant eye, part of a colourful mosaic, seemed to stare back at him. As she shared the contents with Annabelle, she shivered. I dreamed of that name, Niog-Sehra. In the dream, it called to me with my father's voice, but it was deeper, like it came from deep within the earth. Jonathan cautiously explained that the blood of the Arkham line seemed to be an essential part of the seal, or summoning. William took you away from the mansion for a reason. He knew you were more than just an heir, he said. Annabelle was silent for a moment, then spoke, her eyes fixed on nothing. I never knew who my mother was. I was always told she died in childbirth. But what if she was part of this cult? That idea cast a permanent shadow between them. Doubt, horror, and revelation now formed an unbreakable knot that bound Annabelle to the entity, and Jonathan was beginning to feel like he had crossed the point of no return. In the days that followed, Annabelle began to paint with more intensity, as if possessed by an invisible urgency. She drew overlapping circles, featureless faces, and doors that opened onto absolute darkness. Jonathan, for his part, immersed himself in translations of the grimoire, cross-referencing information with William's journals and old maps of the estate. One phrase from the book seemed to repeat itself in different sections. When the blood awakens, the seal darkens. When the flesh breaks, he walks. One night, leafing through one of the last pages, he found a recent note from William, written in a trembling hand. I kept him asleep, but she dreams of him, and if dreaming is remembering, then the seal is already broken. Jonathan slammed the book shut, but he could feel the truth creeping into his mind like a slow poison. The revelation of Annabel's origins loomed over them like a spectre. Jonathan, with the doggedness that only repentant skeptics know, delved into the estate's forgotten records, examining baptismal books, servants' diaries, and letters exchanged between family members in the late 1920s. In a letter hidden in the lining of a secret drawer, William wrote to someone named Elias Crane. She was born of ritual. The child has the blood of the shared seed. The mother disappeared soon after. I tried to raise her far away tenderly, but the dreams began early. As Jonathan finished reading, he felt the floor of the library shake beneath his feet. This was no longer a theory. Annabel was the living link between the flesh of men and the consciousness that rested beneath the foundations of reality. When confronted, Annabel remained silent for long minutes. Then she sat before the unlit fireplace and stared into the void as if facing a truth too old to be named. So all this, all of it, is because of me, she asked without tears, with only a voice made of dust. Jonathan knelt beside her. It's not your fault. You didn't choose this, but now you can choose what to do. She looked at him, and in that instant he saw the shadow of his father in her. Not the man, but the defeated guardian, the last obstacle between the creature and the world. If I am the key, then I can open or lock this door, right? She murmured. Jonathan nodded, but did not say what he thought, that the seal already seemed cracked, and the evil presence no longer slept. It was only pretending. From that night on, Annabel's sanity began to visibly crumble. During the day, she wandered around the house like a castaway, her eyes fixed on dark corners, her trembling hands painting on the walls, doors, even the stone floor. Her fingers bled, but she did not stop. She drew symbols that pulsed like open wounds. It sings to me, under the floor. It says I'm almost ready, she whispered once when she was found sleeping in front of one of the wooden-covered windows. Jonathan tried to help her, tried to lock her in the room, tried to keep her away from the grimoire, but his attempts were in vain. The house seemed to conspire so that she would always find a way to approach what was forbidden. Jonathan began to feel the effects too. The hallucinations intensified. One morning, when he looked into the mirror in the west hallway, he saw himself, reflected not as he was, but old and wasted, with empty eyes, and his skin marked with symbols identical to those Annabel had drawn. He recoiled, but the reflection remained still for a moment before smiling, a smile that was not his own. He began to hear rhythmic thumping sounds under the floorboards, as if something were digging from the inside out. In his dreams, he saw the house crumble, and from the abyss, a shapeless figure emerged, with eyes that were mouths and mouths that whispered with Annabel's voice. "Do you love me?" it said. And then the sound came, the same drawn-out whisper he had heard when he first opened the grimoire. It was getting closer and closer. Even in the midst of the chaos, there were moments of silence, and in them they clung to what was left of humanity between them. In one such moment, Jonathan held Annabel as she trembled, her eyes cast toward the ceiling. I don't want him to take me, but sometimes I want to know what's on the other side," she said, her voice shaking. Jonathan held her tightly, as if his touch could seal the cracks in her soul. "You're still here with me. As long as you are, we'll fight." But he knew deep down that time was running out. The mansion was alive, and the entity was breathing with it now. The discovery of the passageway had happened almost by accident. Jonathan, exhausted after yet another sleepless night, had gone to fetch water from the kitchen when he noticed that one of the floorboards beneath the carpet was loose. Pulling it up, he revealed a trapdoor covered in centuries of dust and cobwebs. He called Annabelle, and together they opened the entrance. The smell that emerged was of damp stone and old bones. They descended slowly, lanterns in hand, revealing a spiral staircase of weathered stone covered in inscriptions that snaked up the walls, symbols that had been seen in the grimoire. The air below was heavy, still, as if sealed for centuries. Each step felt like a violation. These catacombs were not made for the dead to rest in. They were made to watch over the sleeping, Jonathan murmured, feeling the sweat dripping even in the cold. The first level of the catacombs revealed slime-covered altars, arranged in a semicircle, with candles that, absurdly, looked as if they had been burned out only a few days ago. There were bones of small animals, rusted ritual objects, and inscriptions in dead languages: Aramaic, corrupted Sanskrit, Latin, and something else, something illegible. In the center of the chamber, a stone circle held 7 blackened metal seals, each marked with unique symbols. Annabelle approached as if in a trance, kneeling before the first seal. "He is here. He sleeps, but he listens. He dreams of us as we dream of him," she said. Jonathan pulled her back. "That's not you talking." She nodded, but she didn't resist. There was a force there, a magnetic pull, a primal call. This was the heart of the mansion, the womb of darkness. In a recess carved into the wall, protected by an iron trapdoor, Jonathan found ancient letters stored in a box, sealed with red wax. His hands shook as he recognized William's handwriting. He read the letters one by one, panting. "She is the link. I have tried to stop it, but the cult remains, hidden among the servants, among the faces that have served for decades. The abyss has eyes everywhere. If the ritual is completed, it will awaken through her. I have failed." In another, older letter, "Burn the book. Break the seals. Run. If you cannot do any of these things, pray you will not be remembered." Jonathan looked at Annabelle, who was now weeping silently before one of the walls, where the stone seemed to pulse like a living organ. "There is still time, Annabelle. We must stop this, now." She lifted her face slowly. "You saw the eyes, didn't you? In the mirror. They're looking at you now, too." Jonathan hesitated, but nodded. Ever since he'd opened the grimoire, ever since he'd touched the seals, something had been following him. Something he couldn't see, but felt like a pressure on the back of his neck. The mirrors reflected what he didn't want to see. He heard his name whispered. "The house wants the ritual to happen. All roads lead here," she said breathlessly. Jonathan knew they could no longer deny it. The mansion's servants, too silent, were involved. Every gesture, every look, every bowl of soup left at the door had a purpose. The house was guiding them, and they were obeying. Annabelle was the offering, and he was perhaps the last obstacle. When they climbed back up, they felt something had changed. The air in the mansion was colder, thicker. The gargoyles seemed to have moved, and the candles in the hallways now burned with blue flames. Annabelle, exhausted, locked herself in her room. Jonathan, in turn, sealed the grimoire again and hid it between the stones of a false wall in the library. But the sound, that low, wet sound, did not stop. He breathes, he dreams. As he wrote this in his notebook, Jonathan realized that his hands were shaking again, but not from fear, from helplessness. Everything was leading up to this point. The entity did not need to invade the world. It was already among them, just waiting for the right moment to awaken. The next morning, Jonathan woke to the sound of something being dragged in the hallway. A constant murmur filled the house, as if dozens of voices praying in unison behind the walls. When he opened the door to Annabelle's room, he found it empty. The covers were turned up, the stained glass window half open, and on the table there was only an unfinished painting. It showed the catacomb staircase descending into infinity, with a female figure kneeling before an altar. Jonathan ran down the stairs, shouting her name, but received no response. The servants, until then discreet, now watched him openly, motionless, eyes fixed as if awaiting a command. He went to the library, which he found locked again. When he tried to break in, the butler appeared with a short knife in his hands. "She's down. It's too late, Mr. Hale. It's no longer your choice now." Jonathan fled down one of the side corridors and ran to the east wing, where he pushed open a cabinet that led to the secret entrance to the staircase. With a lantern and the ceremonial blade he had found among the books a few days earlier, he descended back into the catacombs. The air below now seemed to vibrate. The stones shook, and the sound of chanting reverberated off the walls. When he reached the main hall, he stopped in front of what he saw. Annabelle stood on the central altar, in a trance, her arms raised, her eyes completely white. Around her, the servants of the mansion formed a circle, chanting words in the same guttural language he had heard in his dreams. The seal had already been broken. 5 of the 7 discs were cracked. The air smelled of iron and sulfur. The darkness seemed liquid, and the floor vibrated like a ceremonial drum. "Annabelle!" Jonathan shouted, stepping closer. The cultist did not react. Annabelle, entranced, tilted her head slightly and whispered, "He wants to be born. My body is the door. My soul, the foundation." Jonathan ran, trying to reach her, but felt his legs give way as the voices became one, deep, echoing in his mind like ancient thunder. The chamber itself shook, the candle flames bursting into columns, and the ceiling seemed to melt into shadow. "Do you love me, Jonathan?" Annabelle said, but not in her voice. It was the entity's voice, deep, hollow, and hungry. Yet behind that presence, he saw her. For a moment, her gaze cleared and her lips trembled. "If you love me, let me go." Jonathan hesitated, but only for a second. Love and horror fought a silent battle in his chest. He stepped forward, using the blade to cut his palm and smear the blood over the 6th seal. "No, not yet," the cultists cried. But it was too late. The seal burned with purple light and cracked. He ran to the grimoire, resting on a pedestal beside the altar. Amid the convulsion of space, he began to tear out the pages one by one, tossing them into the flames. The portal in the center of the room, now visible, throbbed like an open wound. A black circle, where eyes floated and mouths screamed names forgotten by men. Annabelle was screaming now, not with words, but with pain. "Come back to me," Jonathan screamed, but her hands were already covered in living symbols that crawled across her skin. As the last seal was destroyed, the structure of the catacomb began to crumble. Stones tore from the ceiling, the floor cracked, and the cultists ran in despair, finally freed from their trance, but too late. Jonathan grabbed Annabelle by the shoulders, trying to pull her away, but she pushed him away with sudden force, as if a last flash of lucidity and power had surfaced. "I can seal it again, but I can't leave." The chamber was already beginning to collapse. The sound of voices faded beneath the cracking of the gear stone. Jonathan, tears in his eyes, stepped back. "No, I can't leave you." She smiled for the first time in days, a sad human smile. "You've already saved me, Jonathan. Now, let me save you." And then, with a gesture, the pillars around him collapsed, blocking access to the altar. The surface greeted him with the absolute silence of those who had survived the unspeakable. Jonathan emerged from the rubble, covered in dried blood and soot. His eyes glazed over, and his soul shattered. Behind him, the catacombs of Arkham House had disappeared in a collapse of stone and darkness. The ground was now a jagged field of rubble, but it still gave off a faint, pulsing heat, as if something were breathing below, not dead, but chained by Annabelle's sacrifice. The mansion stood but warped. The windows were cracked. The worm-eaten wood seemed to rot before his eyes, and the gargoyles had all shattered. The servants were gone. Not a single body was found, only emptiness, as if they had never existed. Outside the cult, Jonathan was taken in by locals after wandering onto the road, dehydrated and incoherent. He spent weeks in a Surrey hospital, unable to put together a coherent story. Doctors attributed his condition to a nervous breakdown, a typical occurrence of lonely men immersed in too many morbid cases. When he was finally discharged, he refused to return to London. He bought a modest house on the outskirts of Brighton, where he lived in seclusion, avoiding the press, his former colleagues, and even his family. No one mentioned Annabelle anymore, and he himself did not speak of the mansion. But at home, locked in a stuffy attic, he wrote incessantly. Not like a writer, like a prisoner trying to warn the world from his cell. He wrote in a note left on his desk. Jonathan's writings over the months became obsessive. He filled entire notebooks with symbols that even he didn't understand, texts in languages he had never studied, descriptions of dreams in which the house appeared rebuilt, floating on an endless black sea. In his nightmares, he heard Annabelle calling him, but not in despair. Her voice was steady, calm, enveloped by an echo that was not of this world. "I watch over the sleeper, but he dreams of me, and in his dreams, you are still with me," she would say. Jonathan would wake up with tears in his eyes and ringing in his ears. He began covering the mirrors in the house. Then he would tear them out. But the reflection continued to appear. In the windows, in the puddles of water, even in the glass of broken light bulbs. One night, as he lit a candle in the attic, he saw writing on the wall in charcoal. "She is the prison and the key." He didn't remember writing it. He tried to erase it, but the mark reappeared days later in another room. The whisper returned each time he neared sleep. It was as if something or someone wanted to be remembered, not for revenge, but for continuity. Jonathan began to transcribe everything into a final journal, something he himself called a testament to lost sanity. There, he recorded his doubts, his certainties, his fears, and what remained of the love he had felt. "She saved me, not from a monster, but from blindness. From thinking that everything in the world can be explained by logic. Some abysses don't want to be measured. They want to be feared." Time passed. Years. And Jonathan remained a lonely but calm man. The weight of memory did not abandon him, but he had learned to live with it as one lives with a phantom limb. He wrote letters that were never sent, to a woman no one believed had ever existed. He planted white lilies in a part of the garden where the sun never hit, convinced that she was somehow still watching him from there. One afternoon, he was found sleeping in a chair on the porch, with a notebook open on his lap. On the paper, written in a handwriting different from his own, was a sentence: "I hear your voice, but behind it, he hears it too." Years later, her journals were found by a distant nephew and archived in a university library as an example of obsessive fiction and delusions of trauma. But among the scholars who analysed them, some began reporting recurring dreams of spiral staircases, pulsating doors, and subterranean voices. A professor of ancient mythology disappeared after claiming at a conference that Arkham House was never recorded on official maps. An art history student stopped talking after visiting Ashford Hollow. The village is now avoided. The surrounding forest has grown so large that no one passes the old road. The mansion, they say there are no more ruins, that the earth has closed over it as if it had never existed. But on cloudy nights, some travellers swear they hear whispers as they pass by the hill, and a distant blue glow seems to flicker like the blink of an angry eye. An ancient presence, dormant but never defeated. Something that was contained, but that, once known, has already found a way back. Through dreams, through names. In the last pages of Jonathan's diary, written in shaky ink, there is a single entry that no expert has been able to confirm the date or origin of. If I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice and something behind her. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.